I thought I was done. I thought I was never gonna have to read a cringy conservative article ever again. But a comrade posted this on Facebook, and it's like one of those old 1980s action flicks, you know, the really cheesy ones where, like, there's the old retired cop who spends all his days drinking at a bar, and then all of his, like, old buddies come up to him and they're like, but you're the only one who could solve the case. And he's like, no, I'm retired. I gave that up long ago. And then they're like, but we need you. And he's like, fine, whatever. Let's see what I've gotten myself into this time. The last article we read for article time was from The Federalist, and this one is from the National Review. No cool cover art this time, just a very standard picture of our boy Karl. It's high time we tell the truth about the evils of Marx and Marxism. By Paul Kengor, from September 9th, 2020. In The Devil and Karl Marx, I've attempted to do just that. When I read Cameron Hilditch's review of my book, The Devil and Karl Marx, I sighed and said to myself, this is why our side loses. Consider, I've written a 461-page book documenting the genuinely diabolical elements of Marx and Marxism, hoping to equip conservatives with essential facts and truths our side must know about this awful, resurgent ideology. I attempt to exhaustively document the utterly idiotic, insane evil that communism is. Yet the book gets dubbed a failure, not in the pages of The Nation or the New York Times, but in the National Review, the conservative movement's flagship publication. Oh, Cameron Hilditch, you little bitch. I wonder if that's Paul Kengor's Kautsky. You read all these books that Lenin wrote. He's always dragging on some bitch named Kautsky. I don't know who Kautsky is. One day I'll look him up. Record scratch. Fact check time. Karl Kautsky, Czech-Austrian philosopher and journalist, Marxist theoretician, 1854 to 1938, according to Wikipedia, was the most important socialist theorist during the years of the Second International. Following the war, Kautsky was an outspoken critic of the Bolshevik Revolution, engaging in polemics with Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin on the nature of the Soviet state. Why? Because in Hilditch's view, quote, it exhibits one of the besetting sins of present-day conservative publishing. It is pitched at an incredibly narrow and siloed right-wing audience that is bound to already agree with everything Kengor has to tell them. What's worse, he adds, quote, if you are not already a conservative Roman Catholic, you're unlikely to get very far into this book before putting it down. No attempt is made to convince people who fall outside this demographic of the author's thesis. Marxists, or even moderately progressive readers, will be so turned off by Kengor's insults and his childish dismissals of his ideological opponents that they will rightly dismiss it out of hand. Unquote. Let's address this second criticism first. Hilditch complains that the book is chock full of appeals to papal encyclicals, writings, and statements condemning socialism and emphasizing its incompatibility with the Catholic faith. I am Catholic. The book's publisher, TAN Books or TAN Books / St. Benedict Press, is a very well-known Catholic publishing house. The book is thus understandably very Catholic. To this I plead guilty as charged. This is something that anybody who writes political content or makes political YouTube videos has to deal with is, who is your target audience? Is it people who are already kind of on your side, but you want to convince them further or give them talking points that they can use in arguments? Is it people on the very opposite side of the spectrum who you want to convince to maybe move a little bit towards your direction? Or is it people who are already on your team and you just want to have a fun bash, ripping on the opposition? And I've kind of decided that my main audience is going to be liberals and progressives who I want to convince toward leftism. And if you want to do political writing, that's something that you need to think about. As for my insults and dismissals of an infantile, deadly ideology, I plead doubly guilty. Again, without apology. Let us say this candidly. Marxism is obviously unworkable and astonishingly asinine on its face. Marxism is unworkable. Okay, Karl Marx did not write a prescription for how to build a communist society. He wrote criticisms of capitalism. Like, saying that Marxism is unworkable is like saying that chemistry is unworkable, or that biology is unworkable. Like, what do you mean? It's already working, Chemistry works because it just does, out in the world. Marxism works because you can go outside and see capitalism right now. And you can look and see that the criticisms that Marx has of capitalism do a pretty good job of explaining the things that you observe. Now, whether or not there needs to be a revolutionary party, or in a post-revolutionary situation we're going to have to set up a dictatorship of the proletariat or not, that is up for debate. And Marx had some answers for that, but mostly he did a lot of describing and not so much prescribing. It's about time we stop hemming and hawing and hand-wringing and say so. Why treat with kid gloves something so ridiculous and destructive and deadly? Let's finally admit and shout at the top of our lungs that Marx's ideology doesn't merely distort markets, but creates mass poverty, despair, and death. Let's quit treating it like just another belief system and show it for the evil that it is. Again, he isn't addressing the original criticism of the mismatch of target audiences, Listen, conservatives, if you have a good argument for me as to why Marx's critique of capitalism is wrong, have at it. I haven't heard any. I've seen people try to debunk the labor theory of value, but I've never seen any right-winger who actually understands these theories try to do it. I've only ever seen people debunk straw men of the labor theory of value. So, I'm waiting. Over 100 million dead and counting! Again, a number that was arrived at by a literal Nazi propagandist. And even if that number was true, capitalism has a way bigger body count. Had enough? I have. I'm tired of playing nice about it. Hilditch suggests I offer persuasive intellectual arguments in a winsome and non-sectarian way. Been there, done that. Where has it gotten us? Answer? Over 30 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, communism, socialism, and democratic socialism are surging. Enough? Hilditch writes that the reason most Marxists want to see their political agenda enacted is probably not that they think it's evil, they want to see it enacted because they think it is good. Conservatives must work to show them that they are mistaken, and that there are better means to fundamentally good and decent ends. I've been doing that for decades, and it hasn't changed Marxists' mind. This book, as its title suggests, is meant to smack them upside the head with the truth that their ideology is evil. And again, not addressing the target audience question. So before he says that the book is for conservatives, here he's saying that he's aiming it toward Marxists, but he doesn't answer the criticism that if you insult your audience, if you insult the people you're trying to persuade, you're not going to make any progress. And when I first skimmed through this article, this paragraph here really got me thinking about some interesting ideas. And he says, well, why haven't I managed to persuade any of these people that what they're into is evil? The reason it's so difficult to convince people to change their mind on political ideology is that the fights aren't actually about ideology. These fights have actual material stakes involved. The fights are over food on the table, a roof overhead, health care, security, whether or not you have a job to go to on Monday. That's what these fights are about. Political ideology is the way people understand their material circumstances that they're fighting over. It is the framework through which they analyze those material problems. And people don't choose their side of the fight based on ideology. They choose the side of the fight based on material interests, and then they warp the ideology to match that. That explains pretty much 100% of quote-unquote hypocrisy that we see on both sides of the aisle. People are not morally inconsistent. They're actually pretty much 100% consistent. It's just that either they are lying about the true motivations that are guiding them, or they haven't done the serious self-reflection to actually understand for themselves what they're fighting for. Ideology, if you think about it, is just a series of statements about whose material interests matter. The ideology of sexism is the belief that men's material interests matter more than women's do. Racism is the belief that white people's material interests matter more than people of other races. Neoliberalism is the belief that the material interests of the business-owning class in modern industrial capitalism matter more than the material interests of everybody else. So yeah, he hasn't been able to convince these Marxists based on appeals to reason or appeals to morals, because they're fighting for emancipation for the working class. And this guy, he detests the idea of working class emancipation, because he and his ruling class friends would materially suffer if working class emancipation ever came to pass. Conservatives, if you're listening, if you want to convince us Marxists, what you have to do is explain to us, is to convince us that you have a plan to take power away from bosses and give it to workers, to take power away from landlords and give it to tenants, to take power away from the rich and give it to the poor. But you're not going to do that, because our ideas are not what this guy hates. What he hates are our goals. What he hates is the working class. The article continues. I am reminded of Ronald Reagan's response after liberals denounced him for referring to the Soviet Union as evil. For too long, our leaders were unable to describe the Soviet Union as it actually was, he said. I've always believed, however, that it's important to define differences. The Soviet system, over the years, has purposefully starved, murdered, and brutalized its own people. Millions were killed. It's all right there in the history books. It put other citizens it disagreed with into psychiatric hospitals, sometimes drugging them into oblivion. Is the system that allowed this not evil? Then why shouldn't we say so? He's describing things that America has 100% done. Starved, murdered, brutalized its own people. Fuck yeah. Like I said before, even if communism had killed 100 million people, that is tiny, teeny, weeny, small potatoes compared to the horrors of capitalism. Precisely. The ideology remains as evil as ever, and is somehow making a comeback. Now more than ever, it must be called what it is. As for my failure to achieve what Mr. Hilditch deduces as my objective, let me pause for an added crucial point that I hope all conservatives who haven't learned will learn quickly. Leftists, and especially those that are on the far left, largely aren't interested in such dialogue. Having written nearly 20 books over the last 20 years, many of them on the evils of communism, I know all too well that few, if any, on the left will pick up this book. Why? Because they're close-minded and protect even the worst among their icons. Nah, dude, it's because we're on opposite sides of the class conflict. We're not going to listen to your book because your book is an argument of why we working class people should not fight for working class emancipation. Your book is an argument of why we should be okay with the fact that our lives suck. A case in point. My book gives special attention to Karl Marx's genuinely disturbing poems and plays, which are rife with satanic elements. Oh god. This guy is on some 1980s level reactionary bullshit if he's still in the satanic panic mode. I know Karl Marx was a racist. They found some not so, nice things that he and Engels wrote to each other. But then again, name a white guy who lived in the 1800s who wasn't racist. And is that gonna make me abandon Marxism? No, because I'm not a Marxist because I like Karl Marx. I'm a Marxist because I like the idea of working class emancipation, and it just so happens that this motherfucker has a plan, has the know-how, has the tools to help us reach that goal. These writings were first discovered in the late 1800s by Marx's biographer, Franz Mehring. I don't know how German works. Who, in horror, returned them to Marx's daughter, declaring they should remain unpublished. They were eventually retrieved only by the due diligence of a Marxist scholar, David Ryazanov, of the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. He had the intellectual integrity to preserve and seek to publish them, and ever since, with rare exceptions, mainly conservative biographers such as Paul Johnson and Richard Wurmbrand, scholars of the subject, have almost completely ignored these chilling writings. Nobody gives a fuck about Karl Marx writing a shitty poem or a play. We want the good stuff. We want to know how capitalism works. This is what the left does! It doesn't, by any stretch, obviate the need for conservatives to keep trying to persuade progressives of the error of their ways. I do that constantly, and I won't give up. Yes, please continue trying to persuade us of your idea that working class people deserve to live in poverty and misery. We're all ears. And of course, fuckers like this author will never admit that that's what their goal is, but that's what it is. Every single policy somebody puts forward to make life easier for working class people or better for working class people, to give the working class a slightly bigger piece of the pie or slightly more power over their circumstances, these fuckers shoot it down. If you are working class, this man personally hates you, I can promise you. He won't ever admit it, but he does. But that kind of persuasion was not the purpose of the book. There's just one more criticism raised by Hildrich that I feel I must respond to, lest it get me in trouble with my Protestant brothers and sisters. He condemns my alleged defaming Protestantism as a staging around for full-blown communism. In the section of the book that covers Marx and Martin Luther, actually I took care to say just the opposite, so it wouldn't be misconstrued that way. On pages 60 to 61, I wrote, "Oh my god, the more time that passes since I have last gone to church, the happier and happier I am that I no longer go to church. I tell you what, if you're religious and you're watching this, all power to you, bro. But it is not fucking for me. I cannot believe that I ever spent a single second of my life learning about the arguments between Protestants and Catholics. At one point, when I was Catholic, going through Catholic school, that was slightly important to me." Whatever, what did he write in the book? "Though this book is not the place to adequately treat the subject, it is noteworthy that Karl Marx seemed to appreciate Martin Luther's rebellion from the Church. In no way is that observation intended to equate Luther with Marx or his goals, and certainly not with the destruction produced by communism. For starters, Luther was, of course, anything but a godless atheist, whereas Marx liked what Luther did, or more specifically, liked the byproduct of what Luther did in terms of undermining the authority of the Church of Rome. I haven't read anything that Marx wrote on Luther, Leon Trotsky talked about Luther a little bit in Their Morals and Ours, which I read to you for story time. But we cannot understate the historical importance of the Protestant Reformation. And just as I said before, ideology is the way people view class conflict. That's what it was in the days of the Protestant Reformation. Religion was a stand-in for social, class, and political identity. And when people were fighting over religion, they were not fighting over religion. They were fighting over national identity. They were fighting over material interests. They were fighting over class interests. In the Protestant Reformation, the right to rebel against the Catholic Church was basically a right to rebel against feudalism. Martin Luther lived in the late Middle Ages when capitalism was just starting to take its first baby steps on its own 2 feet, and it would not be able to do that within the feudalistic confines of Catholic hegemony. It would not be able to do that unless local European communities had the right to make their own rules and their own laws and their own policy independently. And that's what the Protestant Reformation was about. It was a political rebellion of certain regions against the Catholic Church, which had been ruling them. At least that's how I understand it. I still have a little bit more reading to do on the subject. Anyway, he continues on. Marx seems to have appreciated that Luther pulled away from the authority of the church. Oh my god, you know what? I'm not going to read the rest of that paragraph. I don't really give a fuck what he wrote in his stupid-ass book. Hilditch says of this section, the Protestant Reformation is presented as leading intellectually to communism. Oh my god, you know what? I agree with you, Paul. That is some bad reading comprehension on your boy Hilditch's part. Oh my god, I'm getting a little peek into conservative infighting. Y'all are so bitchy. I want to make bets. I want to see Paul Kengor and Hilditch fight. They're probably like old, fat, sweaty men, but I want to see them fight. Just the two of them take their shirts off, get in the ring, and just have at it. And then me and all my leftist friends can take bets. I don't believe that at all. It sounds like what our boy Paul was saying was a condemnation of rebellion. He also says that virtually the only readers that this book won't alienate are Kengor's fellow conservative Roman Catholics. This I just don't think is true. Surely Jewish readers, among others, will appreciate how I expose Marx's vicious anti-Semitism in perhaps more detail than anyone herefore has. I blast Marx for statements such as, "The Israelite faith is repulsive to me." Vile anti-Semitism is another ugly aspect of Karl Marx that I badly want people to know about. So, this here gets into all sorts of complicated identity politics stuff that I'm not 100% sure I have much right to comment on. Partly because sorting people into identity categories can be very difficult, and saying who has the right to say what type of things is difficult. Now, I was raised Catholic. I talk shit about the Catholics all the time in this channel. I reserve the right to do so. I don't think there's anything bigoted at all about someone who's raised in a particular culture or religion, or who is exposed to it from, like, their family or their community, to say, you know what, this isn't for me. This sucks. This is ass backward and not helpful for the creation of a just and civil society. Karl Marx himself was from a Jewish background, you could say. Like, his grandfather and several extended relatives going back were rabbis. It also says that his immediate family were Protestant Christian. He and all his siblings were baptized Lutheran. He himself, as we all probably know, was an atheist. I have heard that he did write plenty of things that are definitely anti-Semitic in nature. It is very possible for someone who comes from a particular minority background to internalize negative, hateful ideas about their minority group. Whether or not his own background means that we could give him a little leeway on that, I'm not going to be the one to decide that. Again, complicated identity politics stuff that makes my brain hurt. I guess if there's any lesson to take away from that little tidbit, is that identity is complicated, identity politics is complicated, and whenever possible, stay in your lane. If there is any space at all to give him some leeway, homeboy advocated his whole life for emancipation for oppressed people. He closely followed the events in the American Civil War and was strongly for the abolition of slavery. He was a big advocate for Irish liberation from British colonialism. I think it's definitely possible for someone to believe negative stereotypes or have, bigoted beliefs that they've picked up from the culture that they live in, while still having the smarts to make a decision about which side they want to fight on. If you live in the United States, you're surrounded by racism 24/7, basically. And it's not possible, especially if you're a white person, to grow up in such a society constantly exposed to racist brainwashing without learning some racist beliefs. And since you didn't necessarily choose to be exposed to that propaganda, it's very difficult, even with conscious effort, to unlearn it. But you still have 100% control at the end of the day of which side you choose to fight on, and whether or not you want to stand in solidarity with your neighbors. And I think if we're going to attempt to judge someone's moral character, although I kind of don't necessarily believe in the idea of there being such a thing as a good person or a bad person, we should judge them by their choices and what they advocate for and what they fight for at the end of the day. Once again, though, I'm not here for hero worship. It isn't necessarily important to me if the people whose books I read were themselves good people, because bad people can come up with good, helpful ideas. Fuck, dude, I was a biologist. I studied evolutionary biology and ecology in college. A lot of the pioneers of that field were racist as fuck, and they tried to use their scientific research to prove white supremacy. They were really into scientific racism and stuff. But in the process, they came up with, statistical methods that actually were pretty useful. So you can take the bad and extract the good and keep it. Once again, I'm not here for the guy, I'm here for the goal. I could say much more. I will stop by circling back to my opening lament. Whittaker Chambers! Oh my god, can you imagine walking around your whole life with the name Whittaker Chambers? I would pay money with this man to have my name changed to his, and he can have my name. It'll be like a Faustian. It'll be like in that book by that gay Irish man. Shit, I forget the book's name. I forget the man's name. Where he trades with a painting, and the painting gets old, and he stays young. But it'll be me and that guy with names. And he'll get old and I'll stay young forever. But mostly, I get to walk around with the name Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers, a key early National Review writer and editor, said that when he left atheistic communism, he knew he was leaving the winning side for a losing side. God, I wish. When I read a review like Hilditch's, I see why we lose. I hope he's right. I hope they are losing. They're losing enough that they're scared. And that's good enough for me. Because even if we don't ever achieve full and total 100% working class emancipation, we will at least be able to win bigger slices of pie for regular folks like you and me. And at least make losers like him suffer a little bit. Paul Kengor is a professor of political science at Grove City College. So I guess he's not ruling class. He's more professional managerial. Jesus fucking Christ. Also the fact that an actual professor of political science doesn't understand what class conflict is and what drives political motivation. Fucking bourgeois academics, man. I used to when I was in college, I absolutely looked up to and admired professors and academics so much. And I still hope one day to be a college professor. I think that is my dream job. But when it comes to the social sciences, the stakes are so high in the social sciences. The ruling class has every incentive in the world to get their hands all up into economics departments and history departments and whatnot, and really manipulate what goes on there. That incentive exists probably in other fields too, but especially in economics, they have been very successful in doing so. Bourgeois academics in the social sciences are fucking trash. They haven't the slightest goddamn idea what they're talking about. Somebody with a PhD got up in front of other people and actually tried to advocate for the subjective theory of value. There are people with PhDs who literally believe that things are valuable because we imagine them to be, who believe that all of the wealth that we have in our economy was imagined into existence. And now, as a person who is trained in the sciences, the idea of thinking about things in any other terms besides material dialectics seems silly, because that's how they taught me to think in my biology courses. They didn't call it material dialectics, but all of the basics were still there. Everything is material, with material causes and material effects, and nothing in the world is unchanging. Yeah, fuck bourgeois academics. Except for the few who are comrades. Are academics working class? I guess they're labor aristocracy. Whatever. I'm not gonna think about it too hard. Oh man. This one isn't as funny as the last one. I feel like maybe it's 'cause I'm stepping into the middle of an argument that I didn't hear the beginning of. But we got to talk about class conflict a little bit, and what ideology is a little bit. And so I guess my review does have value in that manner. That's the main thing I've been thinking about reading this article, is this idea of target audience, which is an interesting question for me that I think about as a content creator. And also the idea of how we communicate with the other side, and whether or not it's worth it. And you know what? Sometimes I think it isn't. I think it would be worth it to reach out to working class conservative people, if I haven't completely and totally alienated them with the other content on this channel. Working class conservatives, if you're listening, your boss is not your friend. You're never gonna get rich. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe you will. Statistically, probably not. And you have more in common with a migrant farm worker in Mexico than you have with your boss in the floor above you. Also, landlords are evil. And you're worth so much more. You're worth so much more. You deserve the world. You do. You deserve food on your table, a roof over your head, education for yourself and your children, a good wage. Those are things that you deserve. And sleazeballs like Paul here think that you should have to jump through a million different hoops and bleed and suffer for every crumb you put into the mouths of your children. And I'm sorry if any of my fellow lefties treated you like trash. I'm sorry if I treated you like trash, but there's room for you in our movement. There is. If you're working class and we're working class, we're comrades. And hopefully one day we can put our differences aside and know who the real enemy is. That's all I have to say about this article.